Why does New York pay out $230 million in state funds to an enterprise that abuses animals? The corporate welfare in horse racing. PETA is trying to stop the practice known in the Empire State as subsidies. The horse racing update is next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, a status check on horse racing. After the biggest races of the year, the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont, marked the end of the so-called Triple Crown season. There was no Triple Crown winner this year, but perhaps the best news, no horses died on the track during these races, and no horses were caught using illegal drugs either. Maybe that's what happens when the face of racing, Hall of Fame trainer Bob Baffert, gets banned from all three Triple Crown races because of drug violations with Medina Spirit, last year's Kentucky Derby winner. The horse died in December 2021 and was stripped of the victory in 2022. If you sense it isn't a great time to be in horse racing, you're right. And much of it is due to the progress made by PETA's team to expose the abuses in horse racing. For example, the team's biggest win has been in making headway to stop subsidies in New York. That's where state money is used to inflate purses, which attract infirm horses that could end up breaking down and dying on the track. All that because New York State props up horse racing. With the Triple Crown horse racing update, here's PETA Sr.VP Kathy Guillermo on the PETA Podcast.
The Belmont is one of the biggest days of racing in the United States and one of the biggest racing states in America, New York. And the discussion this year was largely around subsidies for horse racing. And in short, subsidies are corporate welfare to horse racing in New York State. And it's money that goes to racing that could be and statutorily should be going to education in that state.
So it's state money. Where does the state get the money? From regular taxes on its people?
It's not taxes. It comes from profits from video lottery terminals that are in the racinos, the so-called racinos, casinos that are adjacent to horse racing tracks. When the state put these video lottery terminals in, and these are kind of like slot machines, when they put them in New York State and allowed them, the idea was that a certain percentage of the profits would go to education. But in order to get them in at the horse racing tracks, they allowed some of the money to be diverted for a period of time to horse racing. And it's done through a couple of different ways. It was actually a very complicated thing to try to uncover for us when we began looking at it, how and why the state gets this money. But the long and short of it is that every single year, $230 million goes to prop up the 11 horse racing tracks in New York State. And this is money that's used to support all of those things that we hate about horse racing and that we criticize about racing.
So this is money that gamblers who use these video lottery, essentially slot machines, the money they put in, it's a huge amount apparently, $230 million goes to horse racing. That would seem to be a fair deal. I mean, if you were negotiating this deal as from the racetrack perspective, why is this a bad deal for the taxpayer or the people of New York?
Because of what it supports. It wasn't a deal that was really the horse racing industry's to make. This was a deal set up by legislators who happen to like horse racing, saw that it was rapidly declining in New York State, and in fact, without these subsidies would be dead right now. And they came up with a way to divert some of the profits to keep an industry on life support that should have died a long time ago. The money supports things like capital improvements at the racetracks, meaning whatever they build. It goes to make the purses or the prizes, the prize money, a whole lot bigger than they would be normally. It goes to special awards to breeders of horses in New York State. The objection to it is, aside from the fact that this is money that should be going to education under the law, that's where this casino profit money should be going. The objection to it is that it supports, by supporting racing, all that's bad. The deaths of the horses. 1,600 dead horses in New York State since 2009, 105 dead horses last year alone on New York tracks. It supports the exploitation of workers who were on that tracks, which we can get into in a little bit. It supports the drugging issues. I mean, New York State was the site of a huge federal investigation that indicted more than 27 veterinarians and trainers for sales of illicit substances, for drugging horses, leading to the deaths of some of those horses. And this is an industry that really can and should support itself, like nearly every other business in New York State.
Yeah, you called it corporate welfare. It is a form of bailing out a for-profit enterprise, right?
Technically speaking, yes. Now, the New York Racing Association, which owns and operates Saratoga Racetrack, Aqueduct, and Belmont, the ones that most people have heard of, is a nonprofit organization technically. But it's very puzzling to us how this nonprofit that operates under a franchise agreement with the state of New York can then go off and start its own business enterprises. It's in business with Fox Sports to air the horse racing and to have its online gambling platform. It has this gambling platform, and it's also done deals with MGM and Caesars. And so we don't quite understand how it gets this nonprofit status, but nevertheless, technically speaking, it does. But it seems to bring in quite a bit of money in these other ventures that never get reported to the state comptroller when it reviews the franchise agreement.
So $230 million just from this subsidy from the state, without which could horse racing in New York State continue on?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on whom you ask. If you talk to horse racing on Tuesday, they'll tell you, oh, we're fine. Look how big our handle, and by handle, I mean total amount of money bet on horses. Look at all the people who come to our racetracks. But if you talk to them on Thursday, they'll tell you, we can't survive without this money. This is money owed to us. I think one thing is certain: harness racing would be in a great deal of trouble without the subsidies. Its money does not come from under the franchise agreement, but from state law. And the attendance at these harness tracks has gone down something like anywhere from 92% to 99% decline in attendance. They're like ghost towns. If you want to avoid COVID, you need to go to a racetrack in New York because nobody's going. So I have to think that without this subsidy money, they may be looking at a little trouble. It doesn't really matter. This is a private business that needs to take care of itself. And New Yorkers should not be supporting all the things that are terrible about racing.
So these horse racing subsidies to New York, one of the biggest in the state, you told me why, how much is involved. PETA is objecting and is part of a coalition to try to fight or try to reverse these subsidies or end the subsidies.
Yes, we're working with a coalition of human and animal service organizations along with New York legislators on legislation that would end the New York subsidies for horse racing. And, the reasons are many for opposing it. I've touched on a few of them. But for example, one of our coalition members is a Worker Justice Center of New York. And if you look at the rampant wage theft on some of the tracks in New York State, you can understand why people who are concerned about treatment of workers would join our coalition to end the subsidies. Why are we paying for these people to do that? Let me give you just a couple of examples. In 2020, the trainer George Weaver settled with the Department of Labor for $425,000 because he had failed to pay his employees required hourly wages and overtime. Steve Asmussen, and people may know him from our undercover investigation that we released back in 2014 about drugging and worker abuse issues. He settled last year with the Department of Labor for underpaying 170 grooms, exercise riders, and hot walkers. He had to fork over about $450,000 or so. And Chad Brown, we're talking about one of the premier trainers in the United States. He's won 4 Eclipse Awards for outstanding trainers. In 2019, he paid $1.6 million for violations that included failing to provide wages promised and misrepresenting job terms and conditions.
That's a lot of money.
Well, and let's think about this too. These are people who are not being paid overtime. There are a whole lot of issues with temporary workers who are brought in from other countries and come to work in New York State. But let me give you an idea of who Chad Brown trains for. 2 of the folks he trains horses for are Peter Brandt and Robert LaPenta. And Brandt's he's a billionaire businessman. He's an art collector. He's been investigated for tax violations. He's served time in federal prison. LaPenta runs an industrial lighting company. He was fined $1.25 million by the SEC for accounting violations. So you've got trainers working for what appear to be somewhat corrupt owners who are billionaires, and they can't pay wages to their own employees. These people are repeat offenders. Steve Asmussen is the winningest trainer in America right now, and he's settled 3 separate lawsuits with the Department of Labor. So that's why we have Worker Justice Center on board. We also have Live on New York Communities for Change, Strong Economy for All, the New York State Humane Association, NYCLAS. There are about 14 or so members of our coalition now representing 19 million New Yorkers.
And they all see the idea or the fact of horse racing subsidies going from the state of New York to these private concerns, and they just want the whole matter to end.
That's right. Alliance for Quality Education is another one, and you can understand why they would be concerned, since the state originally intended for these profits to support education. There were a lot of people who didn't want gambling allowed in New York. But part of the deal that was struck is that if we are going to allow gambling, we're going to see some of that money go to support education. I don't think that people meant to support trainers like Chad Brown with big fat purses, big fat prize winnings, when he's cheating his employees and working for billionaires.
So the subsidies were seen as just here's a free revenue source coming from the state, and it was a gravy train. You're trying to stop it. How close are you to stopping it?
Well, I don't know yet is the short answer. I think we began this last year. We began putting together the coalition, and we had 2 bills introduced in New York State last year. We had a surprise when the New York Racing Association tried to get $450 million in state-backed bonds to build a fancier clubhouse and grandstand at Belmont Park. And this was a surprise because we thought, on top of the money that NYRA, as it's called, gets, New York Racing Association, of that $230 million, NYRA's raking in about $130 million. It seemed kind of surprising to us that with all their business ventures that they have and the supposed success of Saratoga, that they needed to borrow money with state backing in order to make these expansions and changes to the track. And frankly, let's face it, this is Belmont Park seats 150,000 people or can hold 150,000. They're going to have to shrink that grandstand, and they're going to have to shrink that clubhouse, or it's going to look ridiculous with the number of people they have in.
Yeah, one thing I didn't understand, $450 million to build a kind of Taj Mahal kind of clubhouse at Belmont. Was that the idea? Because that seems kind of excessive when you're looking at an entity that is trying to justify, we need $230 million, in state subsidies.
I understand also they want to build a tunnel from the infield underneath the track to go to the clubhouse and the grandstand, and they may be redoing the track somewhat. But yes, exactly. They've got all these billionaire trainers. Supposedly they have these lucrative business deals. Why do they need the state to back them in borrowing this much money? And I think it's worth noting that the whole reason the franchise agreement came about that gave the New York Racing Association this money from the video lottery terminals is that NYRA was bankrupt. NYRA went bankrupt in the early 2000s, was in big trouble, The state bailed it out with $150 million in cash, forgave all of its debts to the state, and then set up this very lucrative agreement where this money, this subsidy monies, would go to help prop them up. And yet they need to borrow money with the state's backing. This is possibly the worst deal that New York State could ever make. And in fact, if you look at Strong Economy for All's dirtiest dozen state-backed deals over the last several years, you'll see that the horse racing subsidies is one of them.
Is this now the amount of monies in horse racing subsidies? It's $230 million. Is that the amount?
Yes, every year that go to the 11 tracks. There are 4 thoroughbred tracks and 7 harness racing tracks in New York State.
And $230 million a year. For how many years have they received this money?
Well, the harness racing tracks have received it since, I think 2008, and the New York Racing Association track since 2012. Now, the idea behind the franchise agreement with the New York Racing Association was that the tracks were supposed to show that they could become self-sufficient. And they said, give us these subsidies and we'll show you we can be self-sufficient. They have failed to do so. And now they're saying the exact same thing about the $450 million bond. If we can make these changes, we will make racing self-sufficient in Long Island. I don't know how many times New Yorkers are going to fall for that. Let's hope not this time.
Well, so what happened with that $450 million state-backed bond? You were able to stop that, or what's the status of that?
Well, the state legislature stopped it. I mean, we have spent, you asked what we are doing in order to combat these subsidies. We first began educating legislators. And because it took us more than a year to figure out how this all worked because of the very opaque way these agreements have been set up, legislators didn't have a clue either. It was an eye-opening experience for them. And once they saw how much money was going into racing, they objected to the bonds. First, they tried to put it in the budget. It got axed from the budget. Then they introduced it as a bill, and the bill didn't move forward.
So what you're saying is once they got educated, they knew it was a kind of boondoggle and they stopped it?
Well, once they got educated, they knew enough to ask questions. And I think, I can't speak for them, but it appears to me that most of them knew enough not to just allow this bill to go through like every other bill for horse racing has gone through in the past. I don't think anybody ever objected to anything the legislators who were working for the horse racing industry wanted. And when I say working for them, I don't mean literally, but certainly working to benefit the horse racing industry.
So it was just another part of the state gravy train that the horse racing industry expected from their politicians, it sounds like.
I think they were very shocked to be told no, but they're going to be back next year looking for it. And so I think we certainly, as a coalition and the legislators who support it, have a lot of work to do to educate New Yorkers about it. Most New Yorkers have no idea. I think you can tell from our conversation, it's not an easy subject to get your arms around. A lot of different laws and a lot of different regulations. And the Franchise Oversight Board that is dealing with the agreement between NYRA and the state, we can't really figure out when they meet, even though they're supposed to have meetings open to the public.
And yet, all right, they're going to come back and looking for the $450 million in state-backed bonds. But what about the subsidies? That hasn't ended. They're still going to get their $230 million a year, right?
The bills that were introduced this year will be reintroduced next year. And we will take up the education and the effort again when the legislature reconvenes in 2023. But between now and then, we have a lot of people to meet with and a lot of New Yorkers to educate about this. And frankly, we aren't saying end horse racing. That's not even part of this message. The message is, why should New Yorkers have to prop up this private industry? It's not right. It's not fair. It's not decent, given the abuses of this industry. It should pay for itself.
And what about the money, if it didn't go to racing, all this video lottery terminal money that goes to racing, if more of it went to education, Is there anything to suggest that, oh, look, if more of this money went to all these other places, look how much better off we'd be? Is there a case that can be made for that, or a better example for a use of this money?
Well, under state law, the video lottery terminal funds, the extra funds, need to go to education. We would have liked to have seen it divided up among a variety of different worthy causes in New York State, including care of horses, who, as our listeners know, sometimes get dumped, sold to auction, sent to slaughter, abandoned, starved, killed, broken bones. But under state law in New York, it must go to education. And it certainly is a worthy cause. While this year, education in New York had more funds than it typically does, that's not the case every year. And certainly it was a better use for this money as the state legislature originally intended.
After the Triple Crown, racing goes into a kind of, it doesn't go dormant. There's still some summer races, and they're all pointing toward the Breeders' Cup in November. But between June and, say, September, it's kind of light. Where do you think PETA is in terms of trying to make an impact on racing at this point? Because you've been in charge of the group that looks at horse racing, not just in New York, but nationwide. After these premier races, the Triple Crown, the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont, now that that's over, where would you assess where your group at PETA that is, working and focused on horse racing, where would you say you are in 2022?
Our work never ends. I mean, because it's in the public eye, because horse racing is seen on television during these few weeks in early summer, we work all year round. We're exposing abuses that we see. We're in touch with racetracks. We're in touch with racing commissions. We're trying to make sure that the worst of the trainers get kicked out of this business. We're trying to end the whipping. Where we are, I think, is at a very interesting place for horse racing, where we are overall, because we know that the public is not willing to see animals suffer and die for entertainment. And so as long as horses are dying on tracks, it's going to be a dying sport, frankly.
And they're still dying on tracks?
Yes, they are. In spite of the progress that California has made, as I suggested with New York, they're a long way from the kinds of improvements that we've seen in California. 105 dead horses last year, at least 27 dead horses this year alone. So yes, they're very much dying. California took a big chunk of the public's attention, as was deserved, and made a lot of changes. New York hasn't made those same changes. It's made some of them. I say we're in an interesting place now because the federal legislation, the legislation that was introduced as a result of our investigation into trainer Steve Asmussen and was passed, goes into effect on July 1st. And this will be the first time there is essentially federal oversight of horse racing. And the requirements of many of the tracks are coming as quite a shock to those tracks. Now, California has surpassed what the federal rules will now be, but states like Texas, which is fighting back, and Arizona and Colorado and Louisiana and Arkansas, they're far behind. So we're in a place now where we see the number of horses born every year continue to decline, the number of horses available for racing continue to decline, the number of people who care about horse racing continue to decline. And yet we still see this old guard in the racing industry defending their status quo. They seem to have a serious disconnect between the reality of the modern America and their idea that they want to be in charge and do it the way they've always done it.
So you say July 1st for federal oversight to begin. That's going to be a shock for many people who traditionally have seen horse racing as essentially a state-by-state thing where every state has their own regulators. Now they're going to have to answer to the feds?
They're going to have to answer to the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, whose power is given to them by this legislation. And it's going to be a day of reckoning for racing. It's in these first few months that I think racing will determine its future. Because if it fights back and if it continues to say, dead horses are collateral of racing, sorry, I think they're going to find out just how long the public will put up with that, and it's not very long.
I mean, the key thing is you say the public, because this has really been something that's been going on right under our noses, but because of PETA's focus on this issue, people have learned about the issue of dead horses, the issue of a lack of regulation, the issue of drugs in the sport. I mean, it really is linked to the efforts by PETA and other activists.
I think we played an enormous part in putting this on the radar. And, one of the reasons that we're focusing on New York and its subsidies is that New York has comparatively done very little to make the situation better for horses. You look at California, it's not perfect. I would say there are quite a few bad players in California, but you have a horse racing community that suffered when in 2019 they became the focus internationally for all of the horses who were breaking bones and dying in front of the public on the track. And they made serious change. And, I know people don't like to give them credit, but if you look at horse racing in California versus horse racing in New York, the comparison is stark. California is not supported by horse racing subsidies. When they want a big fat purse or prize money in a race, it comes out of their own pockets. It comes out of the thoroughbred owners of California, their pockets. It doesn't come from any other profits in the state. And they have enthusiastically embraced much of what the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority is trying to do. And in fact, as I mentioned, the rules in California actually surpass what the federal rules will be. So your point about there being all these different states and all these different rules, that is right on. That is so true. And this day of reckoning is going to determine the future of horse racing in the United States. Of course, as far as PETA is concerned, it's never right to be exploiting animals for profit. It just is not right to harm and hurt animals. And it's more than dying. It's animals who never get to be horses, who spend 23 hours a day in a stall, never get to be out among others of their own kind. There are lots of things wrong. But at the very least, we need to be taking measures to protect as many of those horses as we can.
Well, a lot of people see the dying horses, and then when that made the news, and when people were realizing, when a horse breaks down and they bring a cloth to cover up the horses so no one sees it, it's because there was death on the track that was happening. And, I always wondered, if horses are dying, it just means those horses shouldn't be on the track in the first place, that they are either infirm, and it seems to me a simple thing that you should be able to spot whether or not a horse is infirm or can't run, and I guess this is what the drugs that have been used in racing, what they do is they mask what the true nature of the horse is. The horse is hurt, shouldn't race, but is racing because of drugs. Somehow the horse exceeds what it can do, and then that contributes to breaking down. It's not a simple matter of, a horse took a wrong step and hit a stone and fell down. It's usually something in the body, the horse's body. So what has California done that is so different to try to cut down on the deaths of horses? Have they tried to scope out first whether a horse is infirm or ready or should be on the track in the first place? Are they doing something that should be basic and that should be done at all tracks, really, when you think of it?
California has done a lot, not all, of what we recommended. They've done a lot of what their own people knew would prevent some of these breakdowns. And they've worked to try to make sure that they do identify those, what we call pre-existing conditions in horses. And this has meant you can't just bring a horse in the night before a race, get out there and do a breeze and then show up on the track. Horses now have to be at the tracks several days before there's a race. I believe it's a week now, so that veterinarians can observe the horse in training and see if they can recognize any soreness or any injury. They have to be transparent about medications the horses are on. All the horses are examined. They've used some scanning imagery to see about possibility of slight fractures or hairline fractures in the bone. Not, I have to add, the scanning imagery that we recommended, which I think would be far superior, but at least they're doing some of that. And they got rid of a lot of the drugging issues. And when I say that, I mean the legal drugging issues. And when you give a horse a whole variety of anti-inflammatories and muscle relaxants and painkillers that are legally allowed in the week before a race, and you do what's called stacking, where you give maybe 7 or 8 different medications, legally that horse tests under the limited amount, but cumulatively they all have an effect. That's what we have said, and what experts have said is the number one cause of a broken leg on a track. They got rid of stacking. That was really crucial to this. Now, we believe if one horse dies, it's not acceptable. It's great that there were 3 horses who, well, let me rephrase that. I don't ever want to say it was great that there were 3 horses who died, but there were more than many dozens of horses who died at Santa Anita in 2019. And in the meet they just finished, there were 3. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable for even one, but it sure is better than the many they had before.
Well, it's like any sport. I mean, if you watch a baseball game and you just say, oh, well, that was a great game, too bad one player died, that would be a tragedy. You wouldn't want to see that. And here, dozens of horses die, and there was an alarm finally, and it got the horse racing industry to do something about it. What I was thinking, all the things that they're doing to make sure that horses are ready, actually it's exposed the racing industry so that there's not that many horses out there in a race anymore. I mean, they're what they call short fields, 3, 4, 5 horses in a race, it sounds like if you force them to play by no drugs and horses, only the fit horses are running, you wouldn't have enough horses. And the racing industry would would fall on its own.
It is a problem for racing that when you insist that horses be healthy, there aren't enough horses. And that's one of the issues that we saw in New York State, to go back there for a moment, because the subsidies have meant they could expand the prize money to ridiculous levels. And they could pay anybody who entered a race basically a participation fee for being in the race, just for showing up and putting the horse in. This encouraged trainers who had unfit horses to put those horses in the races just to get their part of the money. And then that meant more horses died. So it was all about the money. It was always all about the money. That's one of the issues that the horse racing folks like to pretend they love their horses and it's not about the money. But believe me, if they're not making money, they cut corners.
Yeah. And the real larceny is if people are bettors and they're betting on a game that you're betting on a horse who has no right to be in a race, is only out there for exercise. And there are people who are betting on that horse because of the color of the jockey's shirt or, the name or the number. It's stealing from the bettors. You're betting on a game that is unethical, unfair, and maybe the time has come for horse racing to sort of die on its own accord. It's good that you mentioned subsidies because it brings it back to this idea that more subsidies, you have more racing that could be more harmful to the horses.
More subsidies equals more exploitation. It's just really that simple.
Kathy Guillermo is the PETA Senior VP who heads up the division focused on horse racing. And as a point of disclosure, she is also my spouse. For more, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.